In this lecture, I want to talk about the causes of the Reformation. This is a rather standard approach to the Reformation, because it's admitted by all that the Reformation did not just happen or come like a bolt from the blue. With the gift of hindsight, we can see that for more than a century, things and conditions were building up in the church. Conditions that clamored for, cried for something to be done, some kind of reform or change to be effected. And that change came. And it was acknowledged by almost everyone in Christendom or the then Western world that the person or the man from whom reform had to come was the Pope. And there was, in different ways, but throughout the 15th century and into the 16th, a cry for reform, and a reform in head and members, meaning a reform in the papacy itself and in the church itself. And part of the tragedy of the Reformation is that the church before 1517 was unable to reform itself or to set in motion events or changes that would have led to a reform in the church that would have satisfied its members and really affected change. It's possible to go back deep into the Middle Ages when enumerating or toting up the causes of the Reformation. I would like to start simply with the 14th century. And you would find very little who would argue about this. In other words, all of the events or things that I'm going to talk about had made some kind of contribution to what we call the Reformation, and therefore to the Counter-Reformation. The first thing to note is that in the 14th century, there was a period of approximately 70 years, from 1309 to 1377, when the Pope was not living or residing in Rome. He was living and residing in Avignon. Now, Avignon is today part of France. In the 14th century, it was papal territory. But nevertheless, it was felt that since it was part of French culture, that the Pope was somehow or other at least under the influence of the King of France, if not under his thumb. And to make matters worse, in the eyes of non-Frenchmen, all of these popes at Avignon were French. It's universally agreed that they were good popes. They were not bad popes. And they did not do anything to damage the church, intentionally, and some would say, or otherwise, except not live in Rome, where Christendom, except for the French, felt the Pope should be. They were all good administrators. They were all very, very orthodox. But it was just that they were living in a place where they should not have been. Now, in the midst of the Pope living outside of the Italian peninsula, outside of Rome, there occurred one of those events in European history that mark an age forever, one might almost say, and that was the famous or the infamous Black Death. There's no sense in going into, what medically, what kind of disease was it? It was a plague. It was called the plague. And there were 3 waves of it between 1348 and 13 69. And the important thing for us to note is that it decimated the population of Europe. We do not have any hard and fast figures, but it's safe to say that it probably removed 1/3 of the population, or reduced the population of Europe by 1/3, and removed 1/2 of the clergy. That is, reduced the population of the clergy by 1/2. And the latter was critical, because not so much because they were clergy, but because of the steps that were taken to make up the losses. The common opinion is that dioceses or bishops and religious orders also felt their losses very keenly, and they tried very hard to make them up. And that they went out, as it were, and beat the highways and the byways, and brought in and kept unworthy candidates. In other words, they lowered their standards. And you cannot see this immediately. It takes a generation or so for this to appear. But appear it does, that we can see that there's a different type of cleric around, say, in 1400 from those who were there in 1300. Of all the causes of the Reformation, the Black Death is most likely the greatest. Not too long after the Black Death, there occurred something that was far worse than the popes living in Avignon. Under the prodding and the influence of St. Catherine of Siena, among others, the popes finally pulled themselves up from Avignon, or the Pope pulled himself up from Avignon and went back to Rome. But through circumstances that we don't have to detail, the cardinals thought that they had elected the wrong man, and they proceeded to elect a counter-pope in 1378 to the pope who was then living in Rome. And this counter-pope was French. He went to Avignon, and the man, already resident now in Rome, stayed in Rome, and Christendom now had the spectacle of not one pope living where he shouldn't have been, but of two popes, each claiming to be the rightful pope, one living in Avignon, the other in Rome. And this brought untold evils in its wake.